The resource curse, also known as the paradox of plenty, refers to the paradox that countries with an abundance of natural resources, specifically non-renewable resources like minerals and fuels, tend to have less economic growth, less democracy, and worse development outcomes than countries with fewer natural resources. This is hypothesized to happen for many different reasons, and there are many academic debates about when and why it occurs. Most experts believe the resource curse is not universal or inevitable, but affects certain types of countries or regions under certain conditions. The idea that resources might be more of an economic curse than a blessing began to emerge in debates in the 1950s and 1960s about the economic problems of low- and middle-income countries. The term resource curse was first used by Richard Dowdy in 1993 to describe how countries rich in mineral resources were unable to use that wealth to boost their economies and how, counterintuitively, these countries had lower economic growth than countries without an abundance of natural resources. An influential study by Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner found a strong correlation between natural resource abundance and poor economic growth. Hundreds of studies have now evaluated the effects of resource wealth on a wide range of economic outcomes, and offered many explanations for how, why, and when a resource curse is likely to occur. While the lottery analogy has value, but also has shortcomings, many observers have likened the resource curse to the difficulties that befall lottery winners who struggle to manage the complex side effects of newfound wealth. The IMF classifies 51 countries as resource-rich. These are countries which derive at least 20% of exports or 20% of fiscal revenue from non-renewable natural resources. 29 of these countries are low and lower middle income. Common characteristics of these 29 countries include extreme dependence on resource wealth for fiscal revenues, export sales, or both. 2. Low saving rates. 3. Poor growth performance. And highly volatile resource revenues. A 2016 meta-study finds weak support for the thesis that resource richness adversely affects long-term economic growth. The authors note that approximately 40% of empirical papers finding a negative effect, 40% finding no effect, and 20% finding a positive effect. But overall support for the resource curse hypothesis is weak when potential publication bias and method heterogeneity are taken into account. Natural resources are a source of economic rent which can generate large revenues for those controlling them even in the absence of political stability and wider economic growth. Their existence is a potential source of conflict between factions fighting for a share of the revenue, which may take the form of armed separatist conflicts in regions where the resources are produced or internal conflict between different government ministries or departments for access to budgetary allocations. This tends to erode governments' abilities to function effectively. Even when politically stable, countries whose economies are dominated by resource extraction industries tend to be less democratic and more corrupt. According to one academic study, a country that is otherwise typical but as primary commodity exports around 5% of GDP has a 6% risk of conflict, but when exports are 25% of GDP the chance of conflict rises to 33%. Ethno-political groups are more likely to resort to rebellion rather than using non-violent means or becoming terrorists when representing regions rich in oil. There are several factors behind the relationship between natural resources and armed conflicts. Resource wealth may increase the vulnerability of countries to conflicts by undermining the quality of governance and economic performance, the resource curse argument. Secondly, conflicts can occur over the control and exploitation of resources and the allocation of their revenues, the resource war argument. Thirdly, access to resource revenues by belligerents can prolong conflicts, the conflict resource argument. Research shows that oil wealth lowers levels of democracy and strengthens autocratic rule. According to Michael Ross, only one type of resource has been consistently correlated with less democracy and worse institutions: petroleum, which is a key variable in the vast majority of the studies that identify some type of curse. A 2014 meta-analysis confirms the negative impact of oil wealth on democratization. A 2016 study challenges the conventional academic wisdom on the relationship between oil and authoritarianism. Another 2016 study finds that resource windfalls have no political impact on democracies and deeply entrenched authoritarian regimes, but significantly exacerbate the autocratic nature of moderately authoritarian regimes. A third 2016 study finds that while it is accurate that resource richness has an adverse impact on the prospects of democracy, this relationship has only held since the 1970s. There are two ways that oil wealth might negatively affect democratization. The first is that oil strengthens authoritarian regimes, making transitions to democracy less likely. The second is that oil wealth weakens democracies. Research generally supports the first theory, but is mixed on the second.